Horseradish is the most misunderstood root in human history, sacred enough to sit on a Passover table as the taste of slavery itself, prescribed across Europe for 2,000 years as medicine. It was never medicine. Hole in the ground, horseradish has no heat and no smell at all. Cut it, and it builds a chemical irritant in seconds, on purpose, to punish whatever is eating it. Every person who ever swallowed it as a cure was swallowing a weapon. Horseradish is not a flavor, it is a wound. So how does a root that arms itself the instant a blade touches it end up on a silver spoon beside the roast beef and inside the glass tube that tells a doctor whether you are sick? From an oracle to a trench to a laboratory. This is how it happened. Picture a farmhouse kitchen in early winter. A long, pale root sits on a cutting board, dirt still packed into the creases, the skin the color of old paper. Someone takes a knife to it. For about a second, nothing. Then the air above the board changes, and everyone in the room turns away at the same time with their eyes streaming, because something is now in that kitchen that was not in it a moment ago. Here is what actually happened. Inside every horseradish cell, there are two substances kept carefully apart. One is called sinigrin, and by itself it does nothing. The other is an enzyme called myrosinase, sealed in a separate compartment, and by itself it also does nothing. The plant keeps them apart because if they ever met, the plant would poison itself. The knife introduces them. Myrosinase strips the sugar off the sinigrin. The leftover piece is unstable and instantly rearranges itself. And what comes out the other side is a compound called allyl isothiocyanate. It did not exist a moment earlier. The plant was not storing it. The plant built it on demand at the exact instant of damage. And because it is volatile, it does not sit on your tongue the way chili heat does. It evaporates, travels up the back of your throat into your sinuses, and hits nerve receptors whose entire job is to detect chemicals that are about to hurt you. That is why horseradish burns in your face instead of your mouth. Your face is not confused. Your face is correct. The plant came out of temperate Eastern Europe, where the Slavs called it kren, a word that survives almost unchanged across half a dozen languages. It belongs to the same family as mustard, cabbage, broccoli, and wasabi, all of them running some version of the same chemistry. It shrugs off frost. Chop the root into pieces, and every piece becomes a new plant, which is why gardeners who plant it once tend to have it forever. And despite the name it carries in English, it is poisonous to horses. That was just a vegetable. At least, that is what everyone thought. The ancient world did not think it was a vegetable, it thought it was treasure. There is a story, and it should be told as a story, that the oracle at Delphi once told Apollo that the radish was worth its weight in lead, the beet its weight in silver, and the horseradish its weight in gold. Nobody can verify that any real person ever said it, but it has been repeated for so long that it has become part of the plant's identity, which tells you something about how seriously people took this root. The written record is firmer. Cato, writing on agriculture in the 2nd century before Christ, discusses it. A wall painting at Pompeii preserves it. Dioscorides catalogued it among the sharp mustards. And Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, describes a plant that is almost certainly this one and recommends it flatly for its medicinal properties. Not for dinner, for treatment. That was its identity for the next 1,500 years. All through the Middle Ages, both the root and the leaf were prescribed across Europe for an almost comic range of complaints: sciatica, colic, coughs, food poisoning, tuberculosis, rheumatism. It was mashed into poultices and pressed onto aching backs where it did exactly what you would expect a chemical irritant to do. which is turn the skin red and hot and convince the patient that something powerful was underway. Most of that was wrong, but not all of it. Physicians also gave horseradish for scurvy, and that one worked. Fresh horseradish carries roughly 178 milligrams of vitamin C in 3.5 ounces of root, around twice what you get out of an orange. Sailors and villagers eating it through a long winter with no fruit anywhere were taking in exactly the compound their bleeding gums needed. Nobody involved had the faintest idea why. They had no concept of a vitamin, no concept of a deficiency. They only knew that the burning root fixed the bleeding. So the world was right about horseradish for 2,000 years for entirely the wrong reasons, in a way that would eventually make its real career in medicine look almost like a joke. And for all that time, nobody was eating it because they enjoyed it. Then the Germans got hold of it. Somewhere in the German countryside, someone grated the root, stirred it into vinegar, and set it down next to a piece of fish. That is the entire invention. It is also the moment horseradish stops being a drug and becomes a food. By 1597, the news had crossed the channel. John Gerard, in his Herbal, describes the root pounded with a little vinegar and notes that the Germans use it as a sauce for fish and meats the way the English use mustard. Decades earlier, William Turner had already listed the plant in England under the name red coal, but only as a plant, never as something you would put on a plate. The name it ended up with is its own small disaster. In German, the plant is Meerrettich, which means sea radish. English ears heard something closer to maar radish, and the word horse was already doing figurative work in English for anything coarse, oversized, and unrefined. Put those together and you get horseradish, attested in English from the 1590s, a name that describes neither where the plant came from nor what it does. The French, who picked up the habit from their neighbors, at least stayed honest about it and called the stuff moutarde des Allemands, the mustard of the Germans. England took it up and immediately started sorting people by it. In 1640, the herbalist John Parkinson recorded that horseradish sauce was eaten by country people and strong labouring men in parts of Germany and in England too, and then added the line that does the social work for him. "It is," he wrote, "too strong for tender and gentle stomachs." Translation: "Gentlemen, do not eat this." By 1657, another writer was describing it as common knowledge that you slice the root thin, mix it with vinegar, and serve it with meat. Then the ceiling broke. By the 18th century, roast beef and horseradish had become such a fixed English pairing that silversmiths were producing dedicated horseradish pots and horseradish spoons, ornate little vessels built for the sole purpose of bringing a labourer's condiment to a wealthy table properly. The peasant sauce ended up in silver. And while England spent 2 centuries arguing about whether it was polite, several hundred miles east the same route had turned into something nobody would ever argue about. It had become holy. Picture a Passover table in Poland in early spring. Outside, the ground has barely thawed. Nothing green is growing anywhere. The commandment is old and it is specific. On the night of Passover, you eat bitter herbs, so that the bitterness of slavery is not an abstraction, not a story someone tells you, but a taste in your own mouth. Around the Mediterranean, this was easy. Lettuce and endive grow there in spring, and in Sephardic and Middle Eastern communities, lettuce is still the bitter herb today. But Ashkenazi Jews had been moving north and east for centuries, pushed by expulsions and violence and the search for anywhere that would let them stay. And in Poland, in Lithuania, in Russia, Passover kept arriving before the leaves did. There was no lettuce. Some years there was nothing at all. There was horseradish. It is a root, so it sits below the frost line all winter and comes up whole. It keeps in a cellar for months. It travels in a sack. It survives being moved, which mattered enormously to people who were regularly forced to move. It shows up in rabbinic writing early, with Rabbi Eliezer ben Natan of Mainz in the 12th century and Rabbi Eliezer of Worms, the Roker, shortly after him. In the 14th century, Rabbi Alexander Suslin HaKohen, in his Sefer HaAgudda, permits it as a substitute when lettuce cannot be had. The objections came immediately, and they never really stopped. The bitter herb was supposed to be a leafy plant, and horseradish is a root, so some authorities allowed only the large roots, on the reasoning that a large root is really an extension of the stem. Others raised something harder to answer. Horseradish is not bitter, it is sharp. Those are different sensations, and the commandment asks for bitterness. Rabbi Tzvi Ashkenazi, writing around the turn of the 18th century, went further and said of eating a full portion of the stuff that it was a danger and not a commandment. A century and a half after that, Rabbi Shlomo Gunsfried was still urging people back to lettuce whenever they could get it. Nobody listened. By the 18th century, Ashkenazi communities were using horseradish even in places where lettuce was perfectly available, because by then it was not a substitute anymore. It was the tradition. Jews took the Slavic word for the plant and made it Yiddish. Crane, sit with what happened there. A people commanded once a year to taste their own history of suffering ended up choosing out of every plant on earth the one that gives you nothing at all until it has been broken. Then it got on a boat. The largest food company on the planet was built on a vegetable that nobody trusted. In the 19th century, immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe carried horseradish rootstock into the floodplain across the river from St. Louis, a stretch of Illinois called the American Bottom. The Mississippi had spent thousands of years dumping silt there, and the soil came out loaded with potash, which happens to be precisely what a horseradish root wants. It grew bigger and hotter there than almost anywhere on Earth. Families started farming it and never stopped. The Kellers have been working that ground since 1887. Meanwhile, in American kitchens, grating horseradish was a genuinely miserable job. It takes a long time, and for the whole of that time the root is doing to your eyes what we described earlier. So people bought it already grated in bottles, and here is what was in those bottles. Prepared horseradish was routinely cut with turnip and parsnip, cheap white roots that grate to the same texture and cost a fraction as much. Sometimes manufacturers stirred synthetic mustard oil back in to fake the heat they had just diluted out, and the bottles were dark green or brown glass, which everyone in the trade understood was not an aesthetic decision. You could not see what you had bought. That was the point. In 1869, in Sharpsburg, Pennsylvania, a 25-year-old named Henry John Heinz went into business with a friend called L. Clarence Noble, using his mother's recipe and root grown on a patch of his father's garden. His one idea was clear glass. That was it. That was the whole innovation. Put the horseradish in a bottle the customer can see through, so they can look at it and know there is no turnip in there. It worked well enough to become the founding principle of the company. He was advertising his goods as strictly pure by 1872. He went bankrupt in the Panic of 1875 and built the entire thing back from nothing. The ketchup came later. Everything came later. It started with a root and a bottle you could see into. Heinz spent decades afterward pushing for federal food law, and in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act passed. Now pay attention to that compound, the root manufactures, because in another 11 years, an entire generation is going to learn its smell for a very different reason. July 12, 1917. Near Ypres in Belgium, German artillery drops shells on the British line that do not behave like shells. There is no great rolling cloud, no immediate choking. Men report a faint smell and mostly carry on. The liquid inside is oily and amber, and it settles onto the ground, onto packs, onto skin, and it waits. Hours later, the blisters start. Then the eyes swell shut. Then the lungs. The chemical is sulfur mustard. The soldiers did not call it that. They named it for what it smelled like, and what it smelled like, in the crude form that came out of a shell, was mustard, or garlic, or horseradish. That is the only reason the world says mustard gas. There is no chemical relationship whatsoever between that weapon and the plant. In pure form, the agent is colorless and has no smell at all. The odor came entirely from the contaminants left behind by making it. The name came from frightened men reaching for the closest thing in their memory, and the closest thing was dinner. So for the rest of the war, on the Western Front, the smell of a Sunday roast was the smell that meant get your mask on now. Recognizing it quickly was a survival skill. Roughly 120,000 casualties in the First World War are attributed to that agent. It surfaced again in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and it was not comprehensively banned until the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993. The plant had nothing to do with any of it, but the coincidence is worth sitting with because the underlying logic is identical in both cases. Neither one announces itself. Neither one does anything at all until it is opened. And both of them hand you your warning only after the container has already broken. The horseradish version of that property was about to become one of the most useful things in modern medicine. You have almost certainly had horseradish inside a machine that was reading your blood, and nobody ever mentioned it. In 1971, two laboratories on opposite sides of Europe published independently, within months of each other, the technique that became the ELISA. In Stockholm, it was Eva Engvall and Peter Perlman. In the Netherlands, it was Bouke van Wiemen and Anton Schuurs. And what Van Wiemen and Schuurs did specifically was measure human chorionic gonadotropin in a urine sample. That is the pregnancy hormone. That is a pregnancy test. The enzyme they used to do it was pulled out of a horseradish root. It is called horseradish peroxidase. It is not the burning compound. It is a completely different molecule, and it turned out to be close to perfect for the job. It is cheap because horseradish is cheap. It is small and tough enough to survive being chemically bolted onto an antibody without falling apart. And when you give it the right substrate, it changes color. So you attach it to something that hunts for one specific molecule in a sample, and if that molecule is present, the well changes color. If it is not, the well stays clear. Horseradish peroxidase now runs in the region of 80% of all enzyme immunoassays performed on Earth. It is in the blot that confirms a protein. It is in the stain a pathologist reads to decide whether a piece of tissue is cancer. It has sat inside a staggering number of the tests that have told people over the last 50 years what was happening inside their own bodies. The world spent 2,000 years insisting this root was medicine. It is not medicine. It is the thing that tells you whether you need any. And there is one more. On September 29, 2011, at Harvard, a team led by Makoto Imai of Shiga University of Medical Science was handed an Ig Nobel Prize in chemistry for determining the exact airborne concentration of the root's own irritant needed to wake a sleeping person, and for building that into a working alarm. They had tested around 100 different smells. This one wins because it does not require you to hear anything. In trials, nearly every sleeper woke within 2 minutes, including the deaf volunteers, one of whom was awake in 10 seconds. A plant's poison, mounted on a ceiling, waiting to pull somebody out of a fire. Today, almost all of it comes out of a strip of Illinois farmland about 15 miles from downtown St. Louis. Collinsville calls itself the horseradish capital of the world and throws a festival every June with a root toss and an eating contest. Somewhere around 60% of the world's horseradish grows in that small area. Nationally, roughly 24 million pounds of root are ground every year into about 6 million gallons of prepared horseradish. Two strange footnotes to that. First, some of the region's legendary heat was industrial. Sulfur from the steel mills settled into that soil for decades and fed the chemistry that makes the burn. The mills closed, the air got cleaner, and growers now have to put sulfur back into the ground themselves to keep the roots hot enough. Second, most of the horseradish you have eaten was never sold to you as horseradish. Estimates run as high as 99% for the wasabi served in North American restaurants being no such thing. It is horseradish, mustard powder, and green dye. Even inside Japan, the figure is put somewhere near 95%. Every time you have flinched at wasabi, you are almost certainly flinching at a root from Illinois. Look at the distance this thing covered. A wild weed nobody could eat. An oracle's valuation, worth its weight in gold. A physician's cure that half worked for reasons no physician could have explained. A German fish sauce, the English called vulgar, and then served in silver. A sacrament carried across a continent by people who had lost nearly everything else and needed one thing that would survive the journey. A bottle of clear glass that built an empire. A word soldiers used for dying. An enzyme in a tube reading someone's blood, right now, somewhere. And every bit of it comes back to a jar in the door of your refrigerator that is doing absolutely nothing and will go on doing absolutely nothing until the moment you break it open. Horseradish is not a flavor, it is a wound. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part surprised you the most. Smash that like button so more people can find it. More videos like this one are coming.